You're listening to the Brown Perspective, and we are doing a follow up on our conversation about what's going on in Colombia. Here, RO has pulled up an article about some of the things that are happening in Cali, which is really the place where a lot of the conflict, a lot of what's wrong with Colombian society is coming together. You have the indigenous communities close by that have been coming in protesting. I actually, as part of the protest last week, and almost like a Black Lives Matters type of scenario. In this case, Native Lives Matter. They took down the a statue of the founder of the Spanish founder of the city. There's continues to be shootings. Uh, there, unfortunately, because of the road blockages, there are things that there are stores that don't have supply. There's no gas, so there continues to be a lot of turmoil in Colombia now. And I know Herrero has been following what's going on down in my homeland.
One of the things that surprised me is how closely aligned the demands are with some of the demands that you see from a lot of the activists here in the U.S. As you mentioned, it says the now suspended tax reform. The protests have continued, and they have since turned into much broader demands, including abolishing university tuition fees, including a universal basic income, disbanding the riot police force, and improving the security for rights defenders and indigenous activists. So they've definitely been paying attention to what's been going on in the U.S.
They have, and I think in some ways is just a reality of the times. And I do think that what happened in the U.S. in 2020 as the result of the murder of George Floyd kind of reignited a lot of that that passion or that desire to change things and not accept things for how they were. And again, I think things were bad, really bad in Colombia for some time now. Actually, this week there was a release of Jay Baldwin's new documentary, The Boy from Medellin, and that documentary, which was filmed in 2019, is they show what was going on at the time with the manifestations around a lot of the same issues, which of course the pandemic just exacerbated and made even worse.
And you said earlier this documentary was filmed back in 2019.
Correct.
So I was looking a bit into the history of the buildup to this sustained protest movement, because it never comes out of nowhere. It takes a while. The right conditions are there. It's the tinderbox, and then something sparks it, and all of a sudden it just out of nowhere it happens. But I found this article that was pretty interesting. Massive Columbia strike hits neoliberal policies and repression. And when I look at these events, I never look at them as isolated events. I always want to look at them from the context of what are the external forces that are pushing some of the policies in Colombia. And no surprise that neoliberal policies that favor foreign corporations that are imposed on the people that may not necessarily be the best for the people. I read somewhere here that they cut the minimum wage for students under 18, that they are trying to increase the retirement age, that I think even some farmers are being forced to use Monsanto. So, or there's certain actions against farmers that benefit Monsanto because they have to end up using the Roundup. So again, neoliberalism is the deregulation, privatize things for the benefit of the private sector, which supposedly this free market thinking that the private sector is going to regulate itself, but it just ends up price gouging and exploiting people. So yeah, at least this gives me some context as to what's been going on the few years in the lead up to what's happening now.
Yeah, and to me it's funny because the word neoliberal makes it sound like, oh, it's new liberal, and but obviously in the context that you're using it is referred to, as you said, conservative. But then on the other side is liberal, right? Which so much is associated with socialism. And in Colombia, this has been, I think, probably since the founding of the country, since Simón Bolívar in Santander, there was a very different idea between liberal and conservatism, liberales and conservadores. So, like that divide has always been there. And in some ways, what's happening now is interesting because Colombians really haven't had a tradition of mobilizing, because as it happened in the past and as it happens in many other countries in Latin America, oftentimes that protest is associated with communism. Back in the 60s and the 70s, it was associated with communism and infiltration from Russia and China and all those things. So in some ways, one of the reasons that those type of protests have been so repressed, not only in Colombia but across Latin America. So now it's just to what we said earlier, it just reached a boiling point where people are just fed up and are trying to really have their demands heard, seriously considered.
Yeah. And communism has always been the boogeyman that they've used to justify supporting right-wing, repressive, militant governments. Because, oh no, the worst thing that could possibly happen is that communism. And then they would label any type of socialist or anyone that had a desire to try to help the people, maybe help them out, take land from private external companies and redistribute it to the people, and somehow pass policies that benefit the local population. Anyone that was trying to do that would automatically get labeled a communist. And then here comes the U.S., because you can't have anything that's not capitalist, or at least it doesn't matter if it's a dictator, as long as the system that is imposed is one that favors the U.S. But it could be incredibly repressive, and so
Yeah, and can I just make a
yeah.
point? As since you have this picture up, I think just want to highlight that the flags that you see there, both the green and red, and then the multicolor flag, those are symbols of the indigenous people in
Hmm.
Colombia and of that area, particularly in Cali. And it's interesting because the native groups are called Mingas.
Hmm.
So they're Mingas. They're supposed to be basically a community. And what happened is, back in pre-Columbian times, the 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 Incas and some of the other tribes, they had this concept of, we'll work together, we'll help each other, we'll work the land together, we'll do projects together, but we'll make sure that everybody has enough to survive, whether you're a widow that you lost your husband in battle, or you're an old person, or are not able to work the land. We're all gonna come together as a minga,
Hmm.
work and work for a certain period of time, work your lands, and then go work on our land. So in some ways, that is not a communist concept. It's a concept that the concept of taking care of each other, of doing
Hmm.
things
Communal.
collectively in
Yeah.
order to help the individual and the greater good. It's something that has been part of the Americas for a long time.
Yeah. And the other thing that I want to point out here is, we always try to speak about how people need to be aware that when they're reading something, they're not necessarily getting an objective portrayal of the situation. So everything is really biased towards what the media establishment wants you to believe about something. And this is a
Hmm.
perfect example here, because when I go to Google and I type in Colombian protest, these are the articles that I get. So you get the mainstream news stories, NBC, BBC, New York Times, and they always tell you what's the situation, but it's always very passive. Like, they're not really explaining to you how things got this way. They're just telling you, here's what's going on. There's protests, there's shortages, there's people are fed up, there's low minimum wage. They tell you what the problems may be, but they don't tell you what's causing them. And they never connect it to this broader policy of how the government is run with these neoliberal policies that are supported by the US. And so, and this is no surprise, because this is how the propaganda works, that of course we're not going to badmouth a country that we're supporting, and now the policies are backfiring because we just won't talk about it. We'll just make it seem like this just happened spontaneously and we have nothing to do with it. But you see the difference when I then Google something like Colombia U.S. neoliberal policies, and then I start finding these other articles, and this one's from the Party of Socialism and Liberation, that starts breaking down things to you, and you start reading about, oh, like Monsanto and its Roundup. Okay, I'm not going to hear anything about this and any of this broader coverage of what's going on because it's not getting at the root of the problems. And so I think, just to our listeners out there, it's really important to get the mainstream picture just so you can get the high level story of what may be happening. But then it's imperative that you have to go and then try to dig a little deeper to really understand what's going on, so that you don't just get fed information that makes you feel a certain way from the mainstream media. So I wanted to point that out, because you would not get a picture with these flags either in the mainstream media. This comes from the Party for Socialism and Liberation. And I'm not saying that I'm going to agree with everything that I read on this page, but the whole point is that these days there's so much information out there on the internet, but it's scattered. And you have to piece it together. You have to go to all the different sources, and then you have to start piecing the information together yourself. You can't let these websites and these news agencies tell you what's happening and then tell you how to feel or make you feel a certain way.
Yeah, which is also, I mean, it's difficult to do, but I think one of the reasons why there's also a lot of spread of fake news or perspectives that are not well researched or well thought out. But to your point, it takes a lot for you, for us, for all of us to try to be as educated and remain critical, right? Ask the questions and dig a little deeper. But I do want to go to a previous point that you made, that this whole narrative that makes it look like an accident, like something that happens. And it's interesting because this week I had the opportunity to attend an event with the author of the book called The Color of Law, A Forgotten History of How Our Government Segregated America, by Richard Rothstein. And basically he made this point that the segregation, the discrimination that happened to African American blacks here in the U.S. was intentional. It was federal laws that prohibited realtors to sell developments, to sell homes to African Americans, and there's a whole litany of policies that were purposefully driven to keep Black people, Latinos, and Asian Americans, down. And then, similar to what you're saying, a lot of the side effects, a lot of the things that are happening now are the direct result of foreign policy, both of the U.S., of England, of some of the other superpowers that do all these policies that impact our countries and try to advance their interests at the expense of ours.
Right. And this one here, I believe this one implicates the World Bank. Right. So
yeah.
Social movement organizers have identified the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank as pivotal in promoting these reforms, the neoliberal reforms. And for people out there, if they want to get a sense of how the IMF and the World Bank operate, and how they go in there and then use money, weaponize loans to suit their interest, and to extract natural resources while they put the countries into debt. You want to go out there and read Confessions of an Economic Hitman, because he breaks down how the formula, how it works. And so, yeah, it's important, again, to really try to be a critical thinker when it comes to this information. As George Carlin said, you don't believe anything that your government tells you or the State Department tells you. That should be your starting point. You read what they say, but you don't necessarily have to believe it. But that's your starting point to then the real task begins of trying to really understand. okay, what's really going on? Because what the State Department, they have their own agenda, and most of the time, the State Department is not out there. The CIA, the World Bank, all of these government, either banks or agencies or NGOs, they're out there for corporate capitalist interest. They're not out there for the benefit of the average American or the average citizen in the countries that they're exploiting.
Hey, but you're forgetting that they're starting to recruit woke people.
Oh yeah, yeah. I'm so glad that they're giving us now the opportunity to also become economic cisgender hitmen.
Wow, that's breaking it down.
Yeah. So the other thing that I wanted to mention is here that there's been 42 deaths. I believe when we spoke last week it was 20. So definitely the police are still out there shooting what I would suspect for the most part are unarmed protesters. That these protesters don't are not carrying guns and trying to shoot at police. Maybe it's a mob, so mobs take their own a life of their own. So maybe they could get aggressive. They could start breaking and destroying private property and things like that, setting things on fire. But just it just goes to show that how the police is conditioned to quell people, protesters that are unarmed.
And that's the case, and definitely the police response has been problematic. And I know part of the issue has been that there's been some policemen, and actually some of them were caught in Cali. They were dressed in civilian clothes, but they tried to beat and shoot at the protesters, but sort of they figure out there were police officers in plain clothes. But I think there's also some private citizens and some folks from organized crime that are also shooting indiscriminately or shooting at the native. For instance, a lot of there's been some native protesters that were shooting as they were shot at as they were entering the city. So there's also a lot of actors, but for sure the police, the Colombian police has a large proportion responsibility for the aggressive nature of the response.
Okay, well, thanks for the update here. I think we'll keep an eye on this. We'll do an update next week. We want to also express solidarity with the protesters. Definitely, that's the only way to get a government to listen to the people is sustained protest. And I was happy to see here that the protests in Cali have been mainly peaceful. I think it's been outside of Cali where some of these deaths have occurred. But with more sustained pressure, the more the government is going to have to be forced to do something.
Glad to help open our eyes and our minds about what's going on in the southern part of our continent.
Yep. If you all out there like our content, make sure to check us out. We are Brown Perspective. Nos vemos.
Ciao.